Hi everyone. Thank you all so much for coming to this talk about my quest to improve my skill for reading source code. Before the lights went down, I saw the whole audience. You're all looking really great, and you can tell that it is the last day of the conference because I see a lot of people are wearing the conference t-shirt, so nicely done, you look great. Cool. Oh, and by the way, everyone calls me K-Wu because wherever I've been, there are always a lot of other Katies and Catherines around. True story, when I started at New Relic 3 years ago, on our larger team of like 15 people, 3 of us were women, and we were all named some variation of Kate or Katie. So that's where that nickname comes from, but I will respond to either, whatever is easier for you to remember. So, as I mentioned, I had set this goal of getting better at reading code. And the origin of this was about a year ago, I joined the Ruby agent team at New Relic. And what we do there on that team is we write that New Relic _RPM gem there. So as you may know, then I really like Ruby. Maybe not, like Anne's gives me a good run for my money because she is at a Ruby conference even though she is a Python programmer now. But one thing I do have is that my hair matches the Ruby logo, at least it is red all the time. So one does what one can. If anyone has a Ruby tattoo out there, I think you'll probably win though. Anyway, so I'm really into Ruby, but working on this Ruby agent team, it was a little bit of a change for the job that I'd had before. I was a Rails programmer then, and the difference now is on this Ruby agent, rather than using frameworks, we have to look inside them and see how they're built so that we can instrument them and provide you some of that application performance monitoring that we're known for. So a lot of times when we have the question of, what does this do? The answer is in the code somewhere. So that's why I ended up setting this as my technical learning goal. One piece of advice that I read early on was from Edmund Lau, who runs a great blog at theeffectiveengineer.com and also has a book about becoming more effective in your job there. And he says to be fearless in diving into code that you don't know. Now this is much easier said than done, I think. Because if you ever heard of this idea of needing 10,000 hours of practice in order to become some kind of expert, even if we assume for 40 hours a week at work, no vacation, no coffee breaks, I know, some people are just really terrified, some people are, I'm sorry. But even just assuming that, not even writing code, just reading this, just this one part of the skill needed to do our jobs, that works out to be about 250 weeks, which is just under 5 years. Now, I'm kind of curious, how many people here have been writing in Ruby for less than 5 years? Oh, good, like a fair amount. Yeah, I've been writing Ruby for 3 years now. So, and there's a lot of breaks in the middle there. So it's not even close to that. And when I think about it, there's a lot of productive struggling that is supposed to happen here. For me, I found that even just setting this goal explicitly really helped me make progress because it made me push myself to spend more time really understanding why something was happening and thinking through the code and trying to build up that mental model. A friend of mine likens this act to something like code archaeology, because we need to dig into the past of what was happening here, but also you need to work very patiently to uncover some of those mysteries in the code. So overall, I have 3 general areas of advice from this topic based on what I had learned, and they are to make sure you can actually see the code to start, to remember your question, and then when all else fails, to make sure to enlist help as well. So I'm going to talk about this in the context of a particular problem I was trying to solve at work a few months ago. As Stella helpfully mentioned yesterday, New Relic does app performance monitoring. And one of the features that we offer is that we trace your slow SQL queries, and of the 10 slowest per minute, we'll try to go ahead and grab an explain plan. And this is how we do that there. We grab the adapter for active record that you're using, and we just interpolate in the query that you need and execute that on the adapter there. So active record from active record 4 and onwards, you get a lot of these parameterized queries, such as the ones that Jessica mentioned the other day for protecting against SQL injection. So very sadly, if we try to interpolate that straight into what we had previously had in this agent here, it doesn't quite work because that's the item that we have there. And it's very, very sad. So sad. So this is, if you're unfamiliar with this particular meme, that's Sad Keanu. If any of the images that I've included in this talk don't make sense or you're unfamiliar with them, I do have an appendix at the end where I included some search terms so you can familiarize yourself and think that I'm funnier than I actually am. So thank you for that. Okay, so where did this query come from? Well, what we were doing in the agent is that we subscribe to active support notifications for all events of the type SQL.ActiveRecord. And from that, we get this payload that includes that query we were just talking about that has that $1 parameter in there. In this particular query, I just had the 1 parameter that was needing to be substituted back in there. But we do also get this other binds key value pair in that payload, which has that number 42 of the ID that I was actually trying to look up in that particular query. So this is the stage for the problem that I was trying to solve. First part then for trying to find an answer is to actually try and see that code, because I think you need to be able to poke at something in order to try to understand it. So in order to do that, I have a local directory where I keep all of these different open source libraries that I'm taking a look at. And into there, I can just go ahead and clone the Rails repo, right? It's open source. This is one of the beauties of that. I can look for myself directly what's going on there. And once I'm in there, I'll go ahead and check out the particular version that I'm interested in investigating. And in this case, it was Rails 4.2. Now, from here, I happen to have a test app that I was working with that was using Rails 4.2. And in the gem file, I will then swap that out and instead point this to my local copy of the Rails repo that I checked out. So right now, this is exactly equivalent because, again, I had checked out that particular version 4.2 branch there. But as a result, I can be looking through this source code locally, and let's say I identify this log method that seems to be where we're getting that binds parameter in there as part of that payload. I had just grubbed through the code base to find binds and see where that was showing up. And what I probably want to do here, though, is confirm that what I'm looking at is, in fact, the right thing that the code path is hitting. And in cases like these, sometimes really simple tools will get the job done. In my case, I just went ahead and inserted in this really simple put statement out there. And now I know for sure, yes, this is what I am looking for. Thank you very much. Another trick in this general area is that git blame can, in fact, sometimes be your friend. It is not just to git blame a piece of code when you're out, who wrote this? And you git blame and you're like, oh, right, that was me 6 months ago, sorry. Sorry, folks. But with git blame, you can read some of these old commit messages. You can look them up in the tickets, even sometimes pull up those past pull requests and get some of the context of why things are the way they are or how old they are in there, how long they've been around. Because in our particular case, it was a change in our instrumentation between active record 3 and then active record 4 and onwards. So the next area of advice that I have is actually, again, fairly simple, to remember the questions that you're asking and be clear on what you're trying to answer at any one time. Because honestly, it's really easy to get distracted and trying to go down multiple different rabbit holes here. I have to remind myself to try to only learn one thing at a time. Sometimes I'll go as far as just writing down all the questions that I have and then literally writing down the answers next to each of those, because otherwise I may get lost and confused between the different paths that I was exploring. One benefit of this is that even if you have to take a break for the day, this particular project took me a couple weeks at work, interspersed between other support tickets and things that our team was handling. But by writing down some of the answers along the way, even though I didn't get the final answer just yet, it did at least remind me, yes, I am learning things. I did know things now that I didn't before. And sometimes at the end of the day as a programmer, it kind of feels like, what have I really accomplished here? And so I liked having some more tangible reminders of, yes, in my life, I have learned at least one thing before, ever. So that's helpful for that. Another benefit to this tactic is, again, if you do have those interruptions that come up, you can make sure to save your spot and then more easily go back to your work and continue your investigation of that source code that you were reading. So let's revisit that problem that I was working on here. One initial strategy that I was pursuing was to find some way to alter that payload so that the query that I got would not be parameterized. It would have that 42 in there instead of that $1 argument. But I realized that another strategy, in fact, was to find some other method on that active record adapter we were using where we could pass those binds parameter back along inside there as well. But these really are two different strategies. And so for a little while, I got a bit lost because I was mixing the investigations for the two of them. And it was better to remind myself, write all those questions down and keep those a bit more separate. One last area of general advice that I have is to enlist help. And by this I mean find someone who is better than you at doing a thing and then try to learn from them. A common way we do this at New Relic is a lot of pair programming. That's great. Thank you for humoring. Everyone here has been extremely kind, especially when Nico told me at dinner last night that I had a very good Spanish accent, and I was like, oh, that's very nice of you. Anyway, through pair programming, I said, it's great to find an expert and then try to learn from them, but this works as well with people that are of more equivalent skill level to you, or even more junior than you as well, because it's another set of eyes, it's another person that will help you stay focused on that particular question that you're trying to answer right then. Through working with another person, I always learn different types of techniques to use for introspecting the code that we've got, and my secret strategy when then pairing is to go ahead and interrupt them a lot with the questions that I have about what's going on. So these include questions like, what are you looking for? And why are you looking for that? And perhaps most importantly, a question that I like to ask people that I'm pairing with is, how did you know to look there? Because sometimes in pairing, the person just has more experience than I do. They have an intuitive sense of, oh yeah, like by convention, this is where this kind of method might be hosted. But other times, actually quite frequently, they notice something about the very file that we were looking at right then that I had somehow completely missed. So it was really helpful for them to point out, oh, of the 50 lines that are on our screen right now, this is the one that was a clue that made me think we should look here next. And that's been really helpful in my learning. So some of these methods that I have discovered and been taught by other people through pairing, first off, just the caller method on your kernel. What this does is that it will print out the exact backtrace of however you got to that particular point in the code. So if I haven't been able to find the starting point and trace it through, this prints this out for me very helpfully. And again, since we are running these local copies of the open source libraries we're interested in, it has the exact file names, the locations of them, and the line numbers so that I can start working backwards to realize, oh, this is how we got to where we are now. Another helpful method that I learned from someone at work is something called source location, which is really, really useful, again, when you're trying to figure out, oh yeah, this is doing a thing, but which of these methods, like where, there are 5 different places where this is defined in this particular code base, which one are we actually using right now? So, for example, if we fire up a Rails console and we're curious about the try method, where is that defined? And we run this source location on there. Again, we'll get back that exact file name and line number for where this is being defined. So we could go there and look to see, oh, okay, it's this particular version of that method. And in this case, it's in active support, which is pretty cool to learn and to be able to look that up later. One more example is if any of you subscribe to Avdi Grimm's Rupee Tapas series, I really enjoy that because they always teach me little tips and tricks about different things in Ruby that I may not have come across in work yet, but I probably will at some point. And so last week, he had an episode going through this, using this method of method defined. And the problem that he was trying to solve in that particular case is he was curious about which classes implemented a particular class method called try convert. Because he thought, oh, it seems like it's part of some of the core classes in Ruby, but which ones out of all of them that are out there? So the starting point that he used something called objectspace, which can get you a list of all of the objects of a given class. And so since everything in Ruby is an object and they're all of the type class, we can go ahead and this part gets the full list of all the different classes that we would be wanting to comb through. We go through all of them, and then we get their singleton classes because we're looking for a class method, not an instance method, and asking them the question which ones have implemented this try convert method. And we get a short but more than a couple items there of where this method is even defined. This episode, I thought, was really a good reminder of the fact that, again, Ruby is an object-oriented language, and when I first started getting into programming, it was a little hard to wrap my mind around the idea of how you interact with objects necessarily. But I learned a tip from one of Sandy Metz's talks where she noticed that our human brains, they're very well adapted for thinking of things in an anthropomorphized sort of way. So if instead of thinking of them as like different discrete objects, I think of all the items in my Ruby universe as like people or other characters, each one of them, there are always ways to ask them questions, and then they will answer you and very helpfully give you the information that you're looking for. So as an overall recap of the general areas that I've discussed so far, the first item is to make sure you can actually see the code in question that you have questions about. When you have those questions, make sure to stay on top of exactly what you're asking at any one time and write down some of those answers so you're feeling you're making progress as you go along the way. And then, of course, again, that fabulous pun, pair programming, enlisting help from people to learn new techniques of how you're going to investigate what's going on. So I know you're all dying to know what the answer is to that problem that I had. Well, in the end, it was that second strategy that worked, where so the way Active Record works is that there's an abstract adapter class that then has particular adapters for the data store that you're working with. So there's like a Postgres adapter, there's a MySQL adapter, SQLite adapter, and so forth. But in that abstract adapter class, the duck type and the class that the other adapters inherit from, we were able to find a different method compared to the .execute we were using before. So instead of that .execute, we are using .execQuery instead. And what was really helpful about this is similarly, we can still pass in that same parameterized SQL query that still has that $1 parameter in it. But In addition to that, we can also pass in that binds object that we had gotten out of the payload there. So this ended up working. This is what it looks like when you look at one of your slow SQL traces in New Relic. And in particular, in this query, it does still have that $1 argument to it, but it also has successfully been able to fetch the explain plan. So this was released a few months ago in version 3.15.2 of the New Relic RPM gem. Now I'm sure everyone who uses gems here, like you always upgrade them as soon as they come out. For sure, we're always on top of these things. But just in case you haven't tried this yet, if you are on at least that version and you're running Active Record 4 and above, hopefully you're getting a little bit more information from these slow SQL traces now, which I'm pretty excited about. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about going in and reading the source code for Ruby itself. Because when I first encountered this topic myself, I was kind of like, where do you even start? It's a little bit overwhelming. So as a very gentle introduction, and this is honestly something that I always used to just kind of ignore, but on the Ruby docs, if you hover over a method's description, in the top right, there's a link to click to toggle source. And once you do that, you can directly see the C code that is behind whatever method you are reading about in those Ruby docs right then. So that's just a really quick way to dig a little bit underneath the hood right then. Okay, so maybe that's great and all, but you actually want to be looking at the full source of what's going on here. So the click to toggle source, it doesn't include the file name right there, but if you go back up to the top of the page in Ruby docs, in that top left, it will list out the particular file names that are behind the items in that documentation right there. Now, Ruby Team's version control system is Subversion, which is a non-distributed source control system that is older than Git. But they do have a mirror on GitHub, which is really useful for reading the code if you're just curious about what's going on in there. Now, one thing to note for sure is that the branch that you want is actually called trunk, not master in a lot of the cases. And if you're wanting to take a look at a particular version of Ruby, they have branches for each of the major versions as well as tags for the specific .releases that you might be wanting to look into. So overall, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what I've learned from just poking around in Ruby source code, but I want to head it off with saying you don't have to understand everything that you're taking a look at here. You don't have to understand all of it. You can still understand some of it. And sometimes it's not maybe the most direct way to answer a question that you have, but it's still an interesting way to try to look at a problem that you might be trying to solve. So some interesting points that I noted about looking at this Ruby source code here. The first is that the directory is actually pretty flat. Most of the core stuff that, all the stuff that's implemented in C is just in that root directory right there. And terminology-wise, by core functionality, we usually mean that's referring to everything that you just get for completely free in Ruby. You don't have to use require in order to get that functionality in. For any of those are part of the standard library, and those are all just stored in the lib directory there. So standard library stuff is usually items, pieces of functionality that are implemented in Ruby, such as the net HTTP library in there. I mean, as a regular Ruby user, you don't really care. It pretty much looks the same from the outside, but it's interesting to see the division once you dig into the source code there. If you're wanting to get a bit more deep into here, they do have documentation such as this extension.rdoc, which is about an introduction to how to write your own C extensions on top of Ruby. And so that's a good starting point of something to browse through. Digging even further deeper in, if you're curious about Ruby's parser, it's all in this parse.y file, which is then run through Yak that generates the C code that's the Ruby parser. If you've worked in any of the other Ruby flavors, such as JRuby or Rubinius, those also just take this same parse.y file, and because it's the very definition of how you parse things in Ruby. A few more helpful points include that if you're looking at the C code, most methods that are surfaced as Ruby methods begin with RB underscore in their name. One way to find where those method definitions are is to use a regex search with the top hat that forces the search to start from the beginning of a line. Because when I'm looking directly at Ruby code, if I'm looking for a method definition, I'll typically search on def space, whatever the name is, or self dot whatever. But in this case, when you're looking at the C code, you'll want to use that regex to help you focus on method definitions versus method usages. And finally, that rubydoc.org with the documentation, that's actually generated out of the comments in that C code. So if you were looking to start contributing to open source and maybe aren't even necessarily familiar with C, if you come across some documentation that could be improved in clarity, you can go ahead and actually just open a pull request for the documentation directly against that GitHub repo even. So they'll accept documentation pull requests through Git, but if you want features or filing bugs, the tracking system for that is instead at this bugs.rubylang.org area. That's where people might enter an issue and attach some patch files if they're looking to submit against Ruby core. So as wrapping up, I have some resources that I would like to share if you're curious in learning about a bit more. And again, this is in the appendix for the exact spelling if you are curious to look it up. But that character in the top right is a cartoon character of an American show called Futurama, and that's Slurms McKenzie, who is a professional party animal. So I thought, resources, like we're having a great party. But after yesterday, I realized maybe to customize for this conference, I should have put Nick and Raphael up there instead, because they apparently know how to get time. And also today, now that my talk is over very soon, I can finally try some Agua Caliente instead of just talking about it with people. So the first resource that I'm going to share here is actually based on a RailsConf talk from a few years ago that I watched called Reading Code Good. It is, in fact, intentionally grammatically slightly incorrect there. But it's great because this talk was about forming a group of people that would just practice reading through different open source libraries. And so she has a lot of tips for that. I think one of them was sort of like there are a lot of libraries that you can pick that are not even, you can pick a significant section of that that's just 100 lines long. And everyone goes through the effort of going through it on their own, and then they gather and discuss and answer questions about, oh yeah, what does this part actually do here, and what is this for? Another talk that I learned a lot from is one by Schneems called Dissecting Ruby with Ruby. That goes through additional methods where, again, you're using Ruby to ask questions of those very friendly objects, and they will give you answers that will help you in your quest. So there were also a couple of blog posts from earlier this year by Schneems as well as Tenderlove that have some tips for putting out different techniques for debugging in Ruby in particular, which was really helpful. And oh, I should have mentioned as well, these slides are going to get tweeted out by my account in a bit, and they're on my speaker deck. So don't worry, you'll definitely have access to these resources, because if nothing else, like these things are for sure helpful. Yeah, so, some additional resources that I added. If you're really into digging in more into the Ruby nitty-gritty, my coworker, Jason Clark, gave a great talk at RailsConf called GDB, A Gentle Intro. Actually, maybe it was RubyConf, one of those. And GDB is a tool that allows you to inspect running processes. So if you're wanting to look at something that's in production, maybe, GDB will help you investigate that without having to do the method more that I described earlier, where you have all these local copies and you're inserting in binding prize or those put statements of what's going on. So that's a great talk, and it is, in fact, a very gentle introduction. If you're more interested in learning more about the Ruby parser, Singwei has given a talk at RubyConf and Ruby on Rails last year called Time Flies Like an Arrow, but Fruit Flies Like a Banana. So it's about kind of where the emphasis on the meaning is there and how can we tell the difference between those two very similar phrases. So that's a great introduction to the Ruby parser. If you're more into reading books, the book club that I run at work did read Ruby Under a Microscope by Pat Shaughnessy last year. And this, again, really gets into the C-level of, oh yeah, so this, this is in this register, and like here are all the things of investigating what's going on there. So that's pretty in-depth. And finally, if you do want to do more about getting into writing your own C extensions, this is a really helpful guide that got shared with me called the Definitive Guide to Ruby's C API, and that might be of interest to you as well. So I will end with this quote from Juliet Evans, who has a great blog that I really enjoy reading. And she had a post a few months ago about reading some Ruby libraries to troubleshoot something at work. And she noted, look, net HTTP, it's maybe 2,000 lines of code, not including comments. And it has about 1,000 lines of comments as additional helpful pointers of what you're taking a look at. And so the attitude that she had, which I hope you will have as well at the end of this talk, is I can read 2,000 lines of code, mostly, for sure. You can totally do it. I believe in you. So I think we're coming up on a break next. If you have any questions, feel free to come find me. And I also have a bunch of stickers, both from New Relic, the Nerd Knife Fists, the Mount Codemore stickers, as well as some for the continuing education programs that I run in addition to my Ruby agent job at work, including something called LunchConf and some book club as well. So happy to talk about all of that. Please come introduce yourselves. I'm not so good at doing that, which is one of the reasons why I like to give talks so that people will come talk to me afterwards instead. So thank you very much.